So now comes the fun part. We've built the computer, we've got the chip in, and it's running at the stock 2.6 gig. It can turbo boost up and down, but overall it's running at 2.6 gig, which is not that fast. So I want to really try and push this chip, and let's try and aim for 5 gigahertz. So let's get to it. Okay, so overclocking a CPU is fairly easy. A lot of people will tell you it's dangerous or it's hard or it's difficult. It really isn't. You're changing two values in a BIOS and you're watching for temperatures. That's really all there is to it. You can do more things, but honestly, that's about as complicated as it gets. In terms of risk, again, the CPU will thermal throttle. The BIOS will shut itself down, turn the computer off if it gets over hot. You might degrade the lifespan of your CPU if you keep messing with it and abusing the temperatures, but overall, it's about as safe as it could get. So the first thing we want to do, and I'll run you through all the tools to benchmark, is to see where the current computer stands, see where we're at with this actual PC we have. So let's just start with a piece of software called CPU ID HW Monitor. I'll put all the links in the video description. Well, basically, if you spin this up and run it, you will see we have here the motherboard. So it's got the voltages coming from the power supply into the motherboard itself. So you can see the 12 volts, 12 volt, 3.3 is thereabout. You've got your temperatures for any probes that are on the board built in. You've got the fan speeds. So this will be the fan speeds of the 3 water-cooled fans we have. And then the important part here is the CPU. So we can minimize that. You can see we've got temperatures of all the hard drives, RAM, graphics card, everything else. But the only thing we're interested in really is the CPU. So we'll minimize those overall voltages. Well, we can leave them open. You can see in here, this processor has 18 real cores and what looks like 30, or rather we've got 36. I believe it's 18 cores and 64 threads, but can we see in here? Logical processors 36. So we've got physically on the chip 18 cores. So that's the temperatures here. But then logically, it's split into workloads over 36 different virtual processors, if you will. So the temperatures are these 18 real cores, like actual physical cores that will warm up and cool down. So we want to watch the temperatures here. This has already been running. I've been on the computer for a few hours now. And you can see it idles at 20s, which is really good. But you can see we've already hit 49 on the package, which the package is the overall temperature of the entire computer, of the entire CPU. And these are individual spots inside there. So there's room for improvement there anyway, which we'll do later. And the voltages of the cores typically run at about 1 volt. So you can see right now it's kind of clocked down doing 0.7, and you'll see these spike as we stress the computer. So let's just jump straight into it, and we'll open up one of the first benchmarks, which is nice and easy and quick, and that's Cinebench. So if we open this up, you can see it's got some baseline CPUs, our system's top spec, so none of these are going to be anywhere near. Simplest clicking run, and you can see it's running at 2.6 gig there officially. And if we were to spin up the hardware monitor while this is running, you can see it's jumped to 0.9 volts, and the CPU utilization as it's running all logical cores there. And now it's finished its cells down. And you can see we've got a score of 3,207. Run that again. And you can see the turbo boost kicks up to 3.4 gig on the cores. That's the turbo boost kicking in. And again, temperature kind of peaked at 56. And now we have 3219. So you typically run it a few times, but generally 3219 is the baseline we're going to make a note of. Now we're running the OpenGL. And as you'll see this time, if you look at the CPUs aren't doing much. This hasn't actually kicked in yet, it's preparing. So now it's testing. You can see the CPUs aren't being stressed. They're pretty much idling. The utilization is hardly any, but what you will notice if you go to the graphics card is the graphics card is being used. And that's what the OpenGL is kind of testing. Now it's an overall, another benchmark to get. We're not overly worried about this one. but we'll run the test anyway and see what score we get. We'll run this one twice as well, just to get a comparison, so that the whole system is generally warmed up. But like I say, I've already been using it for a few hours, so it doesn't really matter too much. And then I think that's the end of the test about there. So there we go, that's the end of that test. And you can see once it stops, this has gone down a little bit, so it barely even touched the system. It was a very light test. In fact, we'll just do it at that. So we've got 188 and 3,200. So that's our benchmark for one. We've got another benchmark. So we open up this, we can close Cinebench now. Don't need to save the scores. And this time we'll use RealBench. And it's also very important to use multiple tools when stress testing your computer, because different tests on the system, especially when overclocking, can cause different parts of the CPU or different parts of the things the CPU can do, certain calls and certain mathematical behaviors and things inside the core. Certain stress tests will engage other parts of the way the CPU works and could crash the system if it's unstable only in certain areas that, say, draw more power. So Cinebench is quite light and easy. RealBench is another level up. And then we'll move on to, multiple ones. So let's work our way through them, but it is important that you do more than one test to presume your system is stable. So we've got here, we're going to do image editing and coding, which is what I do for all these videos, so that's a good test. OpenGL, again, heavy multi-threading. The voltages you'll see go up, but this is locked in the BIOS right now to probably a safe 1.1, 1.2, so I'm not overly fussed about that. These are the main things I want to monitor here, is the kind of utilization and the temperature. The turbo boost will just boost it up and down, so I'm not too fussed about that. So the attention I'm going to pay is kind of in this area, the temperatures. So let me just pull that up so we can see them more. So let's just click benchmark, and we want to then start, and let's get some benchmark figures. And then obviously you'll notice at the bottom right there to cancel move the mouse. So I'm not going to move the mouse. I'm going to let this run and just fast forward through it so you don't have to wait and watch, and then we'll see the results. So you can see there, that didn't really stress the system much at all. Temperature still never went above the 59. I don't think it even touched it during that whole benchmark. But that's kind of a nod to how powerful this computer is. So now we'll move on to a stress test. And the duration should be 15 minutes here. Well, to be honest, I'm not too bothered about a 15-minute run because this computer is stock. So we haven't overclocked it yet, so there's nothing to kind of worry about as such. But what we are going to do is simply start it and leave it for, say, a couple of minutes just to see how hot the CPU gets, which is the most important thing that I'm bothered about. So I'll leave this running and just keep an eye out on these temperatures here while we're running this test. And then if it does anything intensive, we'll see the spike here. So I'll leave this running for a few minutes and then we'll do another test. Okay, so I'll let that one run for about 7 minutes. And you can see it's slowly over time. It was going up about a degree every minute or so. But I'm not going to bother running it for 15 minutes. It's going to maybe go up another few degrees. But like I say, this isn't overclocked yet. So just generally see that it kind of started, went 60, 61, 62, 63 slowly. And that's all we kind of really are too concerned about there. So that's that test done. The next one we'll move on to. We can do a 3D mark test, but you won't be able to see anything going on. But this is just a general, more for gaming, I suppose. But you can see the specs down here. But let's just go ahead and run this anyway. Let's get some tests. And again, I'll fast forward this result, but let's just get this one out to see, this is a kind of industry standard, if you will, for a benchmark in general. It's not necessarily for overclocking and stress testing. It's more for actually seeing what your computer's capable of. So let's run this one as well. It's good, like I say, have a good mixture of everything. And then we'll jump into the last test. Okay, so there we have it. We have 9,688 as the benchmark. That did take quite a while to run. I don't know if it tells us the time it took to run somewhere. It tells us the time we did run it, but it doesn't tell us the time it took to run. But it took probably about, I don't know, 5 minutes, maybe 10. So you don't really want to run that more than we have to due to the amount of time it takes. So we'll run that at the end once we're happy with a stable overclock to get another benchmark. But really, we don't want to be running that test. That's not exactly designed to, you don't really use that when you're overclocking so much. It's not like a pure overclocking test tool as such. So the last tool we're going to use now is called AIDA64. This one you have to pay for. I believe you can get a trial, but it is one that out of all the others I've used, all the others would stress the computer and nothing would happen. And the AIDA64 tends to crash a lot more computers, so there's certain ways it stresses the CPU, as I mentioned, that use more power than other stress tests. They use specific features of the CPU. So let's jump into that. This shouldn't crash this system because it's a stock system. So let's just jump into the stock system. So we have here as well, you can see even through all those tests, it never went above 70 again, so it might not have gone above there. So let's just open AIDA64. And I will then run, it's as simple as clicking the stress test. And then to be honest, we could use this, because this is the one that usually crashes the systems, we could use this as the initial tool when we're overclocking to test if we can get the thing to crash or not. So you've got a lot of options in here, you've got a lot of ways to do things, you've got different tools that you can use. We're mainly interested in the system stability test. So we'll go to this, and this is kind of an overall test. So it's going to stress the floating point unit, the CPU, cache, RAM. So it's a good way to really clock everything up and see everything happening. You've got the fans, the currents, the voltage, powers, everything, and you can see that you've got all the things you can check here to see what's running where. So overall, the thing that's going to usually harm a system is the temperature. It's going to get too hot and effectively either thermal throttle or shut down because it's too hot. And the second would be the power, simply not being able to draw enough current to sustain itself. So all we should have to do on this, click start, and sometimes literally clicking the start button instantly crashes an overclock system. But I've generally found this to be the kind of best overall system stability tester tool, if you will, that gives definite results of, if it really is stable or not. So I'll leave this running again for a few minutes and we'll see what the temperatures get like. Already you can see the package temperatures rising a lot more rapid than the other benchmarking tools we used. So this is the one we're definitely going to test on from now on to make it quicker when we're overclocking. And what you generally want to do now is, while this is running, or rather generally when you're overclocking, is to bump up the frequency and then run a test. And you wouldn't typically run this for 5 to 10 minutes as such, because you'll be there forever. It depends how how detailed you want to be. But I wouldn't go and change it from 2.6 gig to 2.8 and then run it for half an hour on every single test, because the likelihood is you can push a lot more than that. So instead, you just progressively jump up, do quick tests in general to make sure your packages aren't going crazy out of temperature. And then once you get to a point where you feel you've made significant progress and you might settle at that, you'd then do a further test. The way I generally work is to almost overclock, restart, stress test for a minute, overclock, restart, stress test for a minute, and push it to the extreme to the point where it will crash. So it'll either just, your system will just crash and you'll have to pull the plug. You might have to then just go back to your BIOS, reset the settings, mess around a little bit. But generally, I like to push the system to breaking point, then step it back, and then start testing for longer and longer until I come backwards to the point where the system's stable, instead of going a tiny step forward and then just stress testing for 20 minutes, tiny bit forward, stress testing 20 minutes. You're kind of wasting time that way. But some people prefer it that way. They're more scared to just go push my system to purposely make it break and then step backwards. But I'm not overly bothered about that. So let's just see how this test going on now. So you can see here, we've already hit 77 on the peak temperatures with this test running. You can see the CPUs are all maxed out permanent. The cores are all hitting 3.4 gig. So this is an interesting thing here as well. When you're running the stress test, Turbo Boost at the minute's enabled. Intel's Turbo Boost, which means it'll boost the clock frequencies up. So you can see right now we're running clearly at a stable 3.4 gig, like permanently, full 100% CPU usage. So this is kind of a safe indication. And if we also look at the voltages haven't risen anymore. They're not even a volt on the CPU cores. The temperatures are what they are. You don't really ever want to go above, say, 85, 90 degrees. The package, I think this package can run at 105 degrees before it thermal throttles. But you really don't want to be running consistently at that temperature. So overall, we wouldn't really want this package to go above, say, 90 degrees for any prolonged period. But what you can see here is we're at 100% CPU usage and we're at 3.4 gig. So we should know from this, we can safely and instantly overclock our system to 3.4 gig. So I'm probably going to start my overclock at 4 gig. Let's just go for a push, because we can also see here, it has maxed and peaked at 4 gig, 4.2 for periods. So what's likely going to happen is that it can reach 4.2, say, but it's going to maybe thermal throttle. Or it only had those little bursts of time on there, so we haven't really tested. But either way, I think I can safely assume I should be able to push this straight to 4, say 4.2. Let's just go for well, to be honest, a 4 gig is a fairly massive increase anyway. It's a 2.6 gig processor, so we're already almost doubling it at 4. So we'll go for 4 anyway, and then do a stability test. This has been running for I don't know how long now. There we go, 4 minutes. And we're coming up to 78 degrees. So let's call it, say 5 minutes. This is probably going to peak at 80, and it'll probably continue to rise. But overall, we're more concerned about the instantaneous rises, and then we can work on getting this temperature down for prolonged periods. So overall, the system seems stable. So I'm just going to stop that, and then this thing will cool down. So we have all the tests run now. And the next thing we want to do now really is to restart the system, go into the BIOS and start an overclock. So let's just, jump straight into it. Let's get this computer restarted now. So let's close this down, close this down, close this down. And I'm just going to restart the computer. And then when restarting now, you typically want to be pressing the delete key or F12 key on most modern computers. So it's typically the delete key. It's almost universal now that the delete key will get you in the BIOS. You'll also see, as it starts up, you'll have a brief moment where it will tell you to actually press a certain key to enter the BIOS. So you can see there it says press del. You can just about see it. It flickers up for a brief second. Press del to enter BIOS. So I've just pressed the del key, and then there we go. We're now up and running in the BIOS. So what we want to look out for here, every BIOS is different, but generally if you're going to overclock, you're typically using a decent motherboard to start with, and you'll have settings completely vary everywhere. But this has got settings in here for doing tunes and things. So what we want to look for overall, because you'll see there's a hell of a lot in here, and you might be like, I don't even know where to start, there's that many settings, and most of it you honestly just ignore. The key things you are looking for is the frequency, the multiplier of the CPU. So you can see over here, it says CPU frequency 3.4 at the minute, which again is an indication that we can happily run at 3.4. The base clock is the clock that the RAM, the CPU run off, and then they multiply it here. At the minute it's set to 34. So it's been multiplied up to a 3.4 gig at the minute. which is the turbo mode frequency is trying to get to 4.4 as well. So this has already got some effectively overclocking, if you will, temporary overclocking, like, this boost mode to try and get things up. But we don't want any of that. But what we're mainly interested in is this ratio. We want to boost this ratio up to effectively increase the speed, because it's the 100 megahertz base clock times by the ratio gives you the frequency that the CPU is going to run at, which in this case is 3.4. And that's why it was actually running at 3.4 when it was stressed out, because it's already been set in the BIOS to that. So if you flip through your BIOS, you're basically looking for this ratio to start with. You have here as well, you can look at your options if you have them. Some options you'll want to turn off. You've got AI overclock tuner, so you can just read what it says as well. So it'll say when the manual mode selected, the base clock frequency can be assigned manually. XMP, when selected, the base frequency and memory will be optimized. So this is already kind of set up for automatic tuning, if you will. So we can set that to either XMP, and you'll see here, all core announcements with the XMP setting for improved performance, select no for Intel stock operation. So you can either pre-select it to, if your motherboard has this, pre-select it to upgrade things automatically, like pre-calculate all the values. So it's filled mine in with knowing the RAM, and it's going to handle everything. There's now the base frequency you don't want to alter. So generally I've changed that setting to XMP, which is extreme memory profile. Most motherboards will have this. So we can start by simply setting that to XMP, and then going down to CPU core ratio, and this is by core usage at the minute. So if I say single cores, that means that set the clock ratio of every core to the same. You could do specific cores in this place, and certain CPUs can overclock more on certain physical cores inside the CPU. So some cores might be able to hit, say, 4.6, and there's one core in there that can only hit 4.3 or something, and that's holding back the rest of the chip. So if you really wanted to dial in the speed, you could mess with all these different cores, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stick with specific cores. So we're going to select single cores for this case, and now if we go down, you can see this is where we can enter a value. So if we enter 3.4, it will be 3.4 gig. If we enter 4.0, it will be 4 gig, based on timesing it by this frequency. So as I mentioned, it was running at 3.4 constant, so we know that's a definite safe speed. It's turbo boosting to 4.4, which suggests, because this is auto-calculated, that it was safe to do that. It at least didn't die straight away. So I'm just going to jump in and say go to 44. So we'll get a 4.4 gig clock out of this, which is almost doubling the speed of the CPU at the minute. And we've also enabled this extreme memory profile. So that is also going to potentially affect the RAM as well, because we've set the profile to the RAM. So you don't have to do this XMP thing. The only real thing that you're bothered about is finding the core ratio for the CPU. So the CPU core ratio to increase it. And you should have somewhere where it tells you the base clock, the B clock. Now, we can get into altering the core voltage, because the faster you push it, so the harder you push the CPU, those core voltages that were sitting at 0.96 volts might need more power. But the more power you put on the core voltage, you only want to increase it marginally, will massively affect the thermal of the CPU. So it will raise the temperature significantly. So some motherboards like this one, I believe, have an automatic way to handle the core voltage. So if we just look through, let's see. So you've got CPU core voltage auto. So that's already set. We could set it manually to a different voltage, but this auto tends to work well on these motherboards. You honestly don't really need to mess. If you did, you'd just go to manual mode and then override, and you type in the voltage you want there. And you can see down here the max is 1.2 volts, which I'd never really recommend. You tend to stick between 0.9 volts and 1.5 in most extremes sort of thing, but you typically not mess with this. So we're just going to set that to auto, and instead the motherboard is going to try and handle providing the power that it needs, so we won't have to mess with it. And you can see the DRAM voltage due to the XMP profile has been set automatically to 1.35. So it's changed. This is what it was, 1.2, and this is what it's been updated to 1.35. So that XMP profile has done that for us. And then you can see all these other options that honestly you don't need to worry about. That a lot of these options, as if you really want to push chips and you want to get into really specifics, so trying to push, going for world record type of overclocks or doing something specific. Whereas if you just want to overclock your CPU, you can look for an XMP profile for the memory, enable that if it's on there, and then you just look for the CPU core ratio and just set it and go up in increments. If the system crashes, you can manually adjust the voltage, stepping that up slightly, and mess with those two figures. So between the voltage and the ratio, that really is all your overclock. We might get into AVX if we want to push it a bit further, but what AVX is basically a part of the CPU that can do certain calculations, but the AVX is very notorious for drawing a lot more power. So what can happen is, say we overclock the CPU to 4.6 gig, and we then run a stress test. And Ada, for example, uses AVX on part of the test, and it runs the AVX part of the CPU. That specific part might ramp up massively on thermal and burn out the CPU, say, just thermal throttles and shuts down. But then everything else that uses a CPU that doesn't use AVX might be capable of running a lot faster and generating less heat. So some motherboards, again, offer this ability to underclock, if you will, the CPU in the specific area when AVX is used, so that the thing that's power hungry doesn't run as fast, but everything else can run as fast. But again, we're not too fussed about specifics like that. So let's just focus on the ratio, and if we have to, manually setting the core voltage. And that's all we're going to have to do to overclock this thing fairly high. So with that changed, let's just go to exit and go to save and reset. And then it's going to tell us what we've changed. So we've changed the overclock tuner to XMP. It's then automatically set the certain values like the strap, the frequency, the voltage, the latency. All these have been auto changed, and we've just changed the CPU core ratio to sync all, and we've set the ratio to 4.4. For some reason it thinks it's 4.6 because we toggled it between auto and then sync all cores. So it's set to 44 now from auto, which was at 34. And then we click OK and restart. And we basically hope for the best at this point. So this will restart now. And presume we get into Windows. You typically get into Windows most times, unless you've really gone crazy with the figures and it can't even boot. At which point you can go to the BIOS, and we'll show you how to reset the BIOS. Again, it's different on every motherboard. But there's usually a CMOS reset button, or you can pull the CMOS battery, or there's simply, again, on overclocking boards like this one, there's actually a safe boot start button that just restores everything to slow values and lets you get into the BIOS to start again. So this is now restarting. You'll notice as well, don't panic too much that this is taking a good while to restart, because when you change the BIOS, sometimes it has to do it a full power down, it has to write the BIOS, then it has to restart. So at first, when you apply the BIOS update and then restart, you might start panicking, thinking this is taking a bit longer than usual to restart, like this one just did. But as you can see, this has booted up. And again, don't panic if it kind of just blacks out and doesn't come back on, because you just reset the BIOS and that will go back to defaults, which is, a not overclocked system. So we'll just let this thing boot up. We'll get straight into the hardware monitor, and then we'll run the AIDA64 test again and see the difference. Okay, so let's start up the hardware monitor. We're back in the system now, and let's take a look at the values. So the core, you can see at the minute, is running again. It boosts up and goes down based on load. So we are running, let's get rid of the motherboard one, 0.7 at the minute while it's clocked down. Temperatures look okay. Processors look okay. You can see it has hit the 4.4 already that we allowed it to hit, if you will. So like I say, the first test we'll do is really one that definitely stresses the system. And the thing to be mostly cautious of is you don't always just want to start a system stress test and kind of leave it running unattended, because what is likely going to happen is this package temperature is going to rise significantly more than it did before, especially if you don't have good thermals, which, as we know from what I did when we built this computer, I purposely left the stock thermal paste on the cooler, which is really not very good. So a lot of people just call it toothpaste, and that's just down to the fact that toothpaste isn't designed to be a thermal material, so that's kind of why they give it that name. So we've purposely left that on to firstly clock it up based on that, and then what we will do is once we hit a thermal limit, but we're stable but with a thermal limit, we'll open the computer up, apply some decent thermal paste, and retest to see how much difference the thermal paste made to that. Then we'll push the system a bit further if we can to overclock it more. So let's just start the stress test. So if we click start, and you can see straight away there, it's actually died. So that's what I mean by overclocking certain things and Ada crashing them. So Ada's instantly crashed our CPU at simply 4.4, which is not that extreme. So now it's going to reboot, I presume, and depending on your motherboard and how this handles it, it'll either reboot and detect that it kind of bombed out, or this will just hang and won't reboot and you'll have to pull the plug. Either way, if it doesn't power up, just pull the plug it back in, see if it powers up then. But what we want to do now is go back into the BIOS to tweak those settings. So what it might be is the RAM, because we applied the XMP profile to the RAM as well as overclocking the CPU at the same time, which might have been, the cause. So now we've had a crash, which is kind of where I wanted to start, is to push the system so it crashes. Let's just go ahead and give this another second, and then if it doesn't work, I'll pull the plug and we'll go back into the BIOS and change things. So in this instance, I've had to press the safe boot button on the motherboard, and then you can see now it's saying to us, safe mode, please run setup to reconfigure your system, press F1. So that's about all it does, about as bad as you can really get when you've failed to overclock is you just reset the BIOS. So on this specific motherboard, that's meant clicking the safe boot option, and that's got us back here. So what I'm going to do is change this back to auto, to remove the XMP profile, leave that as auto. So in theory, the only thing that should be changed based on all of this, if we scroll down, or rather, can we not change that until, oh yeah, there we go, sorry. It's already reset this for us. So the ratio is by core usage. So let's change that back to single cores. Let's leave it at 44, and then let's go to exit. So this time, what should have happened is we're back to auto on everything that we had set by the XMP profile, and even though it's showing there as the base clock changing back, it's saved in the original BIOS as already being 44. So it's not showing that we've changed 44, but that's already what we are. So all it's done is set all these DRAM specific options to auto. So what that's going to now test is, was our overclock unstable due to the RAM, or is it because the CPU can't even hit 4.4, which would be kind of disappointing, because I'm sure it can, although it is a fairly extreme overclock. But let's see, let's reboot this system now, get back into the test tool and start again. So here we are again. Basically the system's booted up. It's sat at 4.4, and then once everything's loaded up, it's settling down to the 1.2. Temperatures, it's already peaked at 68, which is a sign that obviously we've overclocked, so it's used more power and more heat effectively. So let's just do the system stability test again, and it's noticed it's crashed. Okay, cool. And then let's start, and hopefully it won't crash this time, but it still does, then it's likely to overclock itself to 4.4, which would be really disappointing because I'm sure this can hit more. Or maybe there's certain things in this test that are messing up specifically. We might need to change the voltage in the cores. So let's just start, and fingers crossed. Oh, and now we've got a different issue. So it's struggling with the Ada test. Now, this ran into a problem, needs to restart. I'm not even going to bother letting this start. I'm just going to pull the plug, get back into the BIOS. Let's lower it down a bit to start with then. And we'll clock it up to the point where it can be stable on Ada. Then we might mess with core voltages. So I'm going to pull the plug. I'll lower it to a 4 gig overclock and start again. Okay, so one thing I want to do, where there's been fairly aggressive with this as well, I left the voltage as auto. So I've just underclocked it down to 4, and we still get the same crashing straight away. So I'm positive that I can get at least 4 out of this chip. The system we built should be more than capable of achieving 4 gigahertz. I expect a lot more from this. I want to push it a lot harder. So the first thing I've done is I noticed this was enabled as well, Asus multi-core enhancement. Optimized turbo core settings, where you don't kind of want the CPU or the motherboard or anything else kind of getting involved in the CPU clock frequency. You want that to happen as little as possible when you're pushing an overclock. So I've just disabled multi-core enhancement. And then I think the key thing here that's messing it up, because I thought with the way that Ada works is that it's a very intensive test. So it kind of ramps up really fast. And at the start, and it's funny how it was practically at the very start of clicking that button when the CPUs ramp up, it crashes. So I figured it's probably, and I could be right here, we'll test now. I've just changed the settings, but I thought let's just start with a fresh one and see. But we want to set I believe the CPU core voltage manually for now, at least until we find somewhere stable. But I've got a feeling the auto on this particular motherboard and this setup is potentially slow at ramping up the power. So when you need more power when it ramps up the clock, and we're doing a fairly extreme overclock, it can't ramp up and provide that power quick enough. So that's my theory. So let's just go ahead and in here go back to the CPU core voltage. And you can see I've just changed it from auto to manual. I'm going to start with a kind of mid-range 1.2 volts to make sure it's got enough power. Because if you run out of power again, you'll have a similar issue where it just dies completely. Or blue screens if you're lucky. So I've basically tweaked the voltage, the multiply down to 40 to give us a 4 gigahertz overclock for now. We have multi-core enhancement off, and now I've simply set the CPU core voltage manually to 1.2. So with those settings done, let's just restart and get back into the settings and then start another test. And hopefully this test won't crash the CPU, but we'll see. Okay, so we're back in the system. You can see we're now at 4 gigahertz and temperatures are about what they were. So let's go back into stability test again. It crashed here. So let's run everything again, and hopefully this time it won't crash. It's not crashed yet, but already we're going to overheat. So yeah, 103, it's peaking fast. Yeah, so this is kind of, let's stop that. This is overheating very quickly now. So that was likely the issue, because now we're providing a constant 1.2 volts. It's not crashing. That's the only real difference we've done there. And it's able to stay. But what you can see is that when you start the test, it's at 30 degrees now. You click start, and almost straight away it's up to 100 degrees. So I'm guessing that was the crash, was the instantaneous sort of power requirements to go that high. So let's now focus. Let's try and pinpoint this down firstly to what's generating that heat. I don't really want to underclock any further. I want to go a lot further than that. So we'll probably end up changing the thermal paste in a minute. But let's get some good figures and figure out what is generating the heat and how fast. Then let's try and improve the thermals of the actual CPU contact with the cooler. And then also check if the cooler even feels hot. But I'm guessing at that quick of a temperature rise, that's a sign of potentially bad thermal contact on the CPU, because it's able to rise so quickly with all that cooling. So I'm pretty sure replacing the thermal paste that's stock is going to make a big difference here. So I know for one, the floating point calculation stuff, the FPU, is definitely a massive heat generator. So if we just uncheck that and run again, let's see if that makes a difference. So yeah, I mean, that's, well, for one, that hasn't peaked at 100 straight away like before. You can see here we ran for seconds and then it instantly thermal throttled and underclocked. So that's helping. But let's get a benchmark now so we can run, well, basically so we can swap the thermal paste at this point. So let's just run this for a minute, say, and make note of the temperature. Or even longer, but we'll see. We want to see the general temperature that we're getting, and then we want to improve on that so that when we enable the FPU, we can maintain the temperatures and then hopefully just simply push the clock further and further. But you can see at this point really that the CPU isn't having an issue with the clock speed. It's having potentially, firstly, a power draw issue, which we fixed by applying a static voltage. And next would be a thermal issue. Now it's thermal throttling. So we've just simply not stressed the FPU to keep these temperatures. And I'm just going to make a manual note of this now. At what point? So we're at a minute here, and the temp, I'd say, is kind of fluctuating between 70 and 80. It's hard to tell, but I'd say between 70 and 80 after a minute. And then we'll leave this to keep settling in and go to, say, 2 minutes. And I said this temperature really, you don't want to be any higher than 90 degrees max for a standard constant running temperature. And that's really, as high as you'd ever want to be. So let's see if this thing can maintain its temperature. This is going to keep rising continually. So we're coming up to the 2 minute mark now. Make a note of that. And again, we should run this longer, and we obviously need to run it with FPU. But the point here is now we've identified that the clock is going to cause an issue with thermals. So it's time to apply some decent thermal paste. So we're at 2 minutes now, and again, it's 79. I'm looking at the whole package temperature here, 79, 75, 80. I'd say if anything, it's maybe gone up a little bit on average, but it's not too bad. It is rising, I think, overall, if we keep looking at the maximum. It's sort of top end of 80-ish more so. So I'd say probably, it does periodically blip down, but again, this is all kinds of signs. The CPU is constantly under the same load. This is sort of an indication that we have bad thermal paste. So I'm just going to write down there, I'd say 75 to 80 is the average after 2 minutes. And we're almost up to the 3 minute mark now. So we'll do 3 minutes, and then we will just go ahead and apply some thermal paste to try and improve this. We can also do, we should do an FPU test as well. Probably on its own, because I bet that's enough to generate the heat all in itself. But with 3 minutes there, it hasn't really changed. So I'd say that's the same for the 3 minute mark with no FPU. So I'm just making a note of that. Now, if we disable everything else, enable just the FPU, and then we click start, we're going to leave this to go down to 30 if we want, just let everything cool down a minute. Which you can see that ramps down the load, it doesn't just instantly shut it off. So just give it a chance to cool. So there we go, we're under 40 now. It's like intermittently up and down, but that's fine. So let's start this test. And I'm not going to leave this running for long. You can see instantly 105 degrees. So that's just, and you can see also it's the, say, this core here, this core. It's not every core, but certain cores are getting way too hot. So again, that is definitely a sign of thermal contact issues, that certain cores are getting hotter than others as well. So really, it's an instantaneous max thermal throttle there. So I think with that said, we will now turn the computer off, open it up, apply some good thermal paste, and then redo this exact test without changing any other settings. So let's do that. Okay, so we've got the new thermal paste applied, and the system's been running for about, I don't know, 2 minutes at most. You can see the overall temperature looks about the same, but bear in mind we are running the overclocked profile. So first thing we'll do is make sure we haven't got worse, which is still a possibility. So let's stress everything except the FPU again. And I believe we hit around the 70 to 80 mark when doing this. So we'll see how this handles. And you can see, to be honest, it looks like it's handling very similar. You want to pay attention to the specific cores as well. But we're running 70, so it's not terrible, it's not great. So that's not making much of a difference there. Now let's try the FPU, which was the issue. And this thing instantly hit 105, which is what we don't want. So if this is still hitting that, then I think the next step is to have to delete the processor. So yeah, it's hitting 104 straight away on the FPU test. But the system is actually stable, but it's running way too hot, and then it underclocks. So the thermal paste hasn't made a difference to that part. So let's just run this test for the general system. And the thing is, we could also be running way too high on these voltages. So even though we're hitting very high numbers, it's simply because we've got far too much power there. So we can also try and dial these down. But overall, even though the thermal paste will definitely help, and it does make a difference, if we're still hitting these kind of high numbers here, which we look like we are, then we're likely simply pushing far too much power, because I have a 360mm high-spec fan in there, which is more than enough to cool this chip when it's running. You know, it should be cooling this chip, no problem. So I think what we'll have to do now is to play with the voltages here to try and improve this thermal issue. So let's just stop that and let's jump back into the BIOS. So I've changed the voltage now to 1.1, and you can see the idle temperature seems a little bit lower. If we run a stress test again, we were hitting 70 to 80 almost straight away before. And now you can see how much difference that's made. So now we're hitting 50 to 60, and it's bouncing between those two stables. So we've made almost a 10-degree difference with this voltage. So you can see how critical this the specific voltage is here on how much power it actually ends up making. So you really want to be finely adjusting this by like 0.05 at a time sort of thing. And what you want to do now is lower this voltage until the system stays stable, so that you're using the least amount of power to get the most frequency. And we're running stable at, I say stable, we're running a quick test, but you know, we're not crashing at 4 gigahertz at the minute. So let's just do the FPU test, which slams the CPU straight to 105 usually, and see if we still get it at that voltage. And let's try and just lower it until it doesn't do that. So if we hit this, yeah, we're hitting 104. Now, the only thing here is maybe only certain cores are using the FPU, but we'll notice, look, core 11 and core 2 are constantly the only two that are peaking, that are drawing the package up. So I'm wondering now whether we focus on clocking core 2 and core 11 down using the specific core frequencies. So that's something we might consider shortly. I think for now we'll just keep lowering this voltage until it's stable, and then we will try and, I guess, I want to try and solve the FPU power issue. So we can try that with, try and get that temperature lower. Then we'll carry on boosting the CPU. So I won't record constantly going in and out of the BIOS, because you know what to do now. I'll just simply jump back to the screen each time, and we'll keep running new tests. And this is all you do. It's just a long-winded process of back and forward, running tests, checking temperatures, checking stability. Once you're happy that you kind of got a balance where it seems stable for long enough and your temperatures are acceptable, that's where you then settle and you run heavy tests. So I'm going to go back into the BIOS and I'm going to change the voltage, core voltage to the CPU down as low as I can get it, where it stays stable for long enough, and then run a solid test to make sure it does stay at that. And then we know that's the power it needs. Then we can work on potentially underclocking the FPU if we can, and underclocking specific cores to allow us to then boost the overall voltage up more. So I'll just reset this core voltage to say 1 now, and let's go for that. So the 1.1 didn't work. Oh, sorry, the 1 volt didn't work, so I've changed it back to 1.1. So I think 1.1, to be honest, we probably even need 1.15 maybe, because 1.2 worked, 1 didn't. 1.1 seemed to me sometimes when I moved the mouse it started stuttering, which is a sign that it's potentially about to crash. So I'm going to set that to say 1.15 and leave that for now. And then also we should start really just benchmarking the CPU alone and not the cache. And not the floating point unit stuff, or rather we want to do all three, but separately. So what I'm going to do is the floating point unit that's getting really hot as associated with the AVX. This is the part of the CPU, whichever cores implement these functions, that get a lot hotter because they're a lot more intensive. So what we can do here is if we enter a value into here, say 10, or say what we're at now, 40 is 4 gigahertz. You subtract 15 off and you'll end up at 2.5 if you put 15 in. So let's put 14 in. And that would mean 40 minus 14 is 26, which means we'd run at the stock frequency. So that should mean that if we do that and enter it for these two, anything that uses a floating point unit shouldn't run at all overclocked. And then everything else should run overclocked with the new power. So let's give that a go and prove that out first. And once we know that that affects the FPU temperature, we'll then completely and utterly just focus on the single CPU frequency and try and push this to an extreme. I want to get this higher than 4. I want it really, much higher. So I'm going to concentrate on improving this. Then we'll jump back to the AVX if we have to lower it to get this up. And then we could also look at the CPU cache to see if we can affect that differently, if that's the only thing that starts crashing after. But let's see. So this should affect the FPU temperature. This is the same, and we're now sticking with a 1.15 volt core for now. So let's get back into Windows and test this out. So we're booted back up again. It's literally just booted up. Go to stability. I'm going to minimize this utilization. I just want to see the frequency. So now we're running at 4. But what should happen when we stress the CPU now? Because that'll still stress other stuff. Let's just do the normal test, make sure everything is stable still, or at least stable enough that, we've tested it short, period. You can see there, the 2.6 gig that we mentioned, some go to 2.6, then it goes to 4, then 2.6. So whenever the AVX instruction set has been tested, which is part of the CPU test, it's effectively clocking it down to the 2.6 gig. To prevent the thing that makes the CPU hot running, hot. So this I've noticed sometimes does this as well. As stability tester is not responding. It's obviously maxing out the CPU, but it doesn't crash. So let's see if this kicks back in. But you can notice the temperatures now are much, much lower. So if this doesn't kick in, we'll kill the test and start the test again. But you can see that's now working. So let's kick back in. The AVX stuff's really helped on thermals. That was clearly the thing that's running away with the heat. So now we can probably push this clock a lot further. So let's just stop this. It's now stopped responding again, I think. Once this stops, we'll test the FPU to see now if that's going to still max out at 105. But in theory now, if we test the FPU only, we should get just 2.6 here. It should never hit the 4s. So let's just let that ramp down, and then we'll start this and see if it's going to impact that. In which case then we can leave the FPU test out, leave these other two out for now, and just test CPU and try and push that CPU frequency higher. Now we know basically if we don't overclock the FPU calculations that we see a much marked difference in temperature. So let's try the FPU now. And you can see there it's now running 80, and it was running 105 instantaneously. And again, it looks like now Core 11 was originally the thing running hot. Now it's Core 12, and Core 2 was, so Core 2 is still the hottest, and then Core 11, which was the hottest, it's now Core 12. So maybe that's it's now offloading it to that core, or maybe the temperature simply, for whatever reason, different there. But those seem to be the two cores that are probably implementing the FPU calculations. But the package temperatures, obviously, it's not skyrocketed to 105 instantaneously. And this is running 91, which is it's acceptable for short term. You wouldn't typically just max out the FPU stuff, and the BIOS will still control this. So it won't let this just run and burn itself out. There's safety limits in there, so it can run 105 degrees and then it will throttle. But until then, there's no throttling going on right now. So even though I don't like running this close to thermal throttle limits, it is running at the minute and seems stable, which is much better than where we were. So I think the next thing now is we will basically just focus on getting the CPU frequency up as high as possible. And I don't know, let's try and get 4.4, 4.6, 4.7, somewhere around there. I think eventually I'll end up delidding the CPU, and we'll do another video on delidding the CPU. Then we should be able to get the thermals down again, because right now the system doesn't seem unstable due to frequency. I know we haven't tested much, but it's not generally unstable at the minute. I think the main issue we're hitting is we're getting to a thermal limit before we're getting to a frequency and stability limit. So I want to now push the CPU frequency until a point where the system's unstable, which I don't think will hit a thermal limit now. Without that FPU clocking up, it doesn't look like there's much thermal issue. So I can really ramp up now the frequency without having to worry about the temperature and look at the stability of basically the limit of the chip itself, because chips have limits. You can't just ramp them up and cool them as much as possible and they'll indefinitely work regardless, because just because it's getting hot, if you can cool it quick enough, the chip itself can still have issues with high frequencies, with simply data getting scrambled and signals not being received correctly. So there are limits as well as thermal. There's limits on frequency, and I want to find the frequency limit, not the thermal limit. So now we've got the temperature down, let's try and find the actual frequency limit of the CPU. So I'm now running at 4.6 gig, and I've stressed the CPU, the cache, and the system memory. It's only been going for 3 or 4 minutes, but I can already see the temps are never going to be an issue, because they're going up to 60, back down to 50, up to 60, back down to 50. So it's already reached its kind of thermal settling point. So the thermals won't be an issue. It's just the longevity of running this test for longer to see the whole system in general is stable. But you can obviously see when you stress everything, you have the AVX throttling, and then you get the 4.6 boosts. So it does run at 4.6. So if we stopped that and just stressed the CPU only, you'll see that a lot more of it will run at 4.6 when it's just the CPU running. It's just that the FPU units get used when you mess with cache and system memory as well. So if we start this, we'll see the max out at 4.6. And this sits just the same. This will go higher. And this is where I ran it here at the start. This was the CPU only test. And then I ran the whole system to see if it's generally stable. But I basically just jumped it straight to 4.6 and started with that. You'll see the funny thing here, apparently I've actually maxed out at 12.5 gig, which I'm pretty sure, well, I don't know if it's inaccurate, but that's pretty funny that it's managed to momentarily jump way above the clock voltage. But again, the thermals are acceptable at the minute. It's only really short term, and this might increase. But overall now, it looks a lot more stable without this FPU getting involved and having thermal runaway. So I'm fairly confident this 4.6 at 1.15 is stable. And again, I don't like to waste time doing this till I find a point where I feel I'm stable, and then I carry on. So I think what I'm going to do now is push it to 4.7, maybe 4.8, because I think we're on the borderline here of ending up with thermal runaway. So realistically, until we delid this thing and get even cooler, that'll be an issue. But it's the CPU itself is quite happy handling this frequency. So I might have to increase this again once we get above 4.6, because that might become the instability point. But then we are almost definitely going to start hitting thermals again. But what you could also do is simply run this test for a shorter period to see if the system handles it and simply bottlenecks at temperature, or whether it crashes before the temperature is an issue. So I'm just going to restart again, and I'm just going to jump to 4.8. Let's just see, because I've got a feeling it's not going to go much more above based on how everything's running. But let's go for it. Let's try 4.8. 4.7. And now it's booted into Windows, so you can see we're now at 4.8 gig. But even clicking that mouse, funnily enough, has now already froze the system. So the 1.2 volts got us a little bit further. But I'm guessing this is now going to crash any minute with another blue screen. Pretty sure it will because the system's hung either way. So we can try it at so let's just jump to 1.3 volts. And let's see if it even is the voltage or whether simply the system is unstable frequency-wise, whether we've reached the limit. So this is completely hung. There we go. So let's try again now with 1.3 volts and let's see if we can even get this thing stable. Okay, so you can see I've got it running at 4.8 gig at 1.25 volts. But the only issue is now we're hitting thermal throttling. It's just hit in after 2 minutes. But you'll notice again, it's this core 3. This core 3 is the thing that's constantly almost 10 degrees higher than everything else. So I think this is a good time where I should do core specific clocking, and I'm going to try all the others running at 4.8 and this one running at 4.6, maybe even 4.5, just try and get that temperature to balance out. So I'm just going to stop that test, restart, and we'll apply a CPU specific clocking if your motherboard supports that. So let's do that. So in here now, let's try instead of sync all cores, let's do by specific core, and then in specific cores, it was effectively core number 4, but it was obviously, it was called core 3 because it was 0 based. So it'll be this core 4 that'll have the value. Now, unfortunately, I'm not sure whether, I'm pretty sure that if I leave it to auto, will set it to the value that we've got as the main one in the menu above. So I'm going to leave that. And I'm going to do, in fact, if I left it all to auto, I wonder if I can just specifically set core 4 to have that value, or whether it's going to lose, no, because there's nowhere stating 4.48 anymore. So we're going to have to go into here and type 48 for everyone. What's the drop down for? Manual mode. Auto adaptive. So I've got even more annoyingly. Oh, that's the voltage, sorry, there we go. 48, 48, and go through these. Leave that one at 46, and then the others at 48. So I'll do all these and restart, and then we'll see if that helps. So you can see now that core number 3 is now at 4.6, which is what we wanted. So it's maxing out at a shorter one. You can also see the temperature is about balanced at the minute with the core next to it that's running faster. So fingers crossed this might allow us to run at 4.8. I still don't know whether 4.8 is stable as, you know, a whole for the system. But now let's see what the temperature does. So again, you can see it's core 3 that is really running away with the heat again. All the others are 60, 80, 70, 60. And this thing wants to be at 90 again. So it might be that we simply underclock this even more and the rest will stay a lot cooler. We seem to have one core that's getting a lot hotter. Core 14, 13 and 12 are similarly getting hotter, but this is still definitely the most hot on the board. And this is really where you could very specifically now dial in your frequencies to every single core to almost see a nice smooth balance between every core's temperature, so that you can then crank up the frequency more overall to keep pushing that boundary of thermal limits. So really now, I think I'm already on the verge of it being thermal throttled in any realistic long-term run now. I've got the best thermal paste you can get, really. I've got the biggest cooler, water cooler that you can get on the into the machine, and really anything bigger wouldn't help anyway, because it's not the volume of liquid now, it's simply the ability to transfer heat away quicker. So we're at a point now where I haven't really hit a frequency limit on this chip. If it was now bombing out and blue screening or black screening without the temperatures rising, that's when you know you've hit a frequency limit on the chip. But because I'm basically back to the point now again of being on a thermal limit, and I'm trying to balance that, I can probably set the system to 4.8, 4.6, somewhere in between, and play with these figures now and stabilize the system and run these tests for longer, and say that's my happy medium, that's my overclock. And then the same with the FPU now. If I enable the FPU and do a full test to make sure that heat doesn't rise further and that it's still stable. But in theory, right now, the FPU hasn't been overclocked. We've underclocked that back down to 2.6. So again, we could just simply rise that up, and we know that was stable at like 4.6 gigs, so way above what it's running at. So there's no concern of the FPU being unstable. It's more the thermal runaway with that. So I think overall now this overclock is quite comfortably running at 4.6 to 4.8 wherever I decide to balance this out. I'll figure out the best one and show you the final settings in a minute. But I think next, if we wanted to push further, we'd really have to either gallium instead of thermal paste, so basically liquid metal, to allow faster heat transfer. Or I think a much more efficient way would be to delid the CPU, which means taking off that metal cover that the thermal, the water-cooled block sits on, that we applied the thermal paste to. And then underneath that, you'll see the CPU's actual silicon chip, so the physical chip that has all the transistors in, because that is what we really need to touch, because that's the thing generating this heat. So that could be after, but let's stabilize the system now, and I'll show you the final settings, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with this setup now. So if I stress everything, which means it'll be a mix between the floating point unit stuff, the AVX and the CPU. The cores will obviously bounce between the regular speed and up to 4.8. At that, the temperatures barely rise, they're not anything extreme. But the funny thing here as well, I've hit 35 gig now as well on this max. I'm not sure what's going on there. But generally the system seems stable. I have run it for, I think, about 5 to 6 minutes here again as a general stability. The temperatures here aren't of a concern. Then once this goes back, so I can click stop. If I run just the CPU to max them out at 4.8, which is what this test was right here. So it's basically as power hungry as it can get, draw as much power as possible. Then that's where we hit, over the course of like 5 to 6 minutes, it starts creeping up to the 98, 99 mark. So even though it seems stable, which I'm comfortable it is stable, it doesn't seem like there's an issue, we are not going to be able to run that sustained for long periods without better cooling. I have got all the cores fairly balanced now as well, so that the core 14 now seems to be the only one that's running slightly hotter than the others, but nothing massively. So like here it's under at the minute. It's when you clock it high up. So again, I could maybe tweak that with a slight voltage adjustment or frequency, but overall, we're not really, they're all fairly balanced. So now they all max out. You can see the only one I've underclocked is core 3 at 4.4. I also changed the voltage to 1.15 on that. And now core 3 sits perfectly in line with everything else, like exactly the same temperatures. And you can see core 14 is only slightly above, it's like 2 or 3 degrees above average, and that's what this limit is. So I could continue to do this, but realistically, that's only 3 degrees above. Everything else is then going to start being the same temperature. So I'm not going to gain much there. And as you can see now, we're at 90, which is really the most I'd ever want to run a chip, and it's only been going for 30 seconds. And over the course of another 4 or 5 minutes, this will keep going up slowly to, realistically, it's probably going to hit the thermal throttle. So I'm comfortable the system is capable of being stable at 4.8 gig with a tweak to a few specific cores. But I'm probably going to, I can run my benchmarks on this, but then when I run it long term, I am probably going to run this clocked at 4.6, say, just so I'm within a comfortable realm of temperature. And then I'll use this extensively now for weeks, and if there's any issues, I'll tweak the settings. But overall, I'll run these tests now for a couple of hours to make sure everything stays solid and stable. And the next step really is going to be better thermal to be able to clock any further than this. But I think overall, that's not a bad result for a 2.6 gig chip now reaching 4.8. So let's just run all the benchmarks now and see what figures we get compared to the first ones. So let's run Cinebench. So let's click run. I think we got 3,200 and something the last time. You can see Cinebench is also using the floating point algorithm by the looks, and it's also stressing the system a different way. So now we're getting 4,164. But you'll notice this is where I said to use different things. We managed to peak quite a few of the cores at 100 degrees, even though Ada64 wasn't capable of doing that. So this is why you have to test the system across, a lot more things than one. Which is why, again, I will probably underclock this to 4.6 to keep it stable for anything that's going to use that. But let's run it once more. Let's get a couple of runs and make sure, obviously, the system doesn't crash either doing that, with it being so close to the thermal limit. And we're getting about the same again. So we've gained almost 1,000 points on there. Let's run the OpenGL as well, which doesn't really challenge anything we've done. It's a mixture of CPU and GPU, but it doesn't really stress anything thermally, and we know the frequencies are stable. I'm comfortable with that. So let's let this one run, but overall that's a 33% gain, I believe, in the CPU speed on Cinebench, which is a decent, a very decent gain, especially when the CPU is meant to be 2.6 gig. So let's just let this one run and see what results we get. And now we get 233. I believe we got 188, if I'm not mistaken, before. So that's 40 frames per second more. So again, that's a decent gain from just doing that. So that's Cinebench. That's a good gain. Let's now move on to RealBench. So let's move this over to somewhere where we might be able to see the temperatures. We've got the temperatures here anyway, but this RealBench overlays on top of everything. But we've got the values we can look at here. So let's just try and see at least what the temperatures are on this benchmark. So we'll let this run and then see the results compared to the last time. So there you can see that run. Again, all significant increases over the last one. So I'll put them side by side here now so you can see the differences and the gains we've got there again. The main one I'm interested in is the encoding, because that's what I'll do all the time. And again, the temperature's only maxed at 86. That's perfectly acceptable. So there's no issues there. I could run this stress test, but honestly, this is not as stressful as the Ada64 test. So I can run that, but I think for pure stress testing of the CPU, you're best using Ada64, because that really does stress the system, whereas this doesn't really stress it in the same way. So I've got a feeling that's not going to really change much about what we're seeing. I do know, like I say, I want to underclock this slightly to stop this thermal getting so high during normal use, but that's that test. And last up is the 3D mark test. So we'll do the 3D mark test now. Just close this down. I think we got 9,600 and something on the first one. So let's run this again now and see what we get. So we got this time a score of 9999, which again, nothing majorly improved. The one thing I will do now though is I want to really crank up that AVX value because I believe that's mostly involved in video encoding. So just to try and boost those scores again, what I'm going to do is downclock it to 4.6, leave the core 2 or core 3 rather under slightly, so less than that again, and then allow the AVX to ramp up more, and let's just run the quick benchmarks to see if that, once we can get better thermals, what results we're likely to have. So I'm just going to tweak those settings and run the RealBench once more. So I've removed these and set them back to auto so they can clock the same as the CPUs, and I've just set the CPUs to 4.6 with the exception of core 4, the fourth core that's called core number 3 in the tests, and that's down to 4.2. So with that, let's run the new test. So we're now back up to the 4.6 everywhere with the 4.2 on core 3, but now the AVX can run to its maximum. So this can likely get to 100 degrees fast, but let's start this test and see how well this performs. I did notice the video encoding, which is my main priority of what I want to increase. It didn't really increase when we overclocked, so that's implies that the floating point unit part of the CPU, the AVX, is what's responsible mostly for video encoding. With that now back up to be allowed, we should see a significant increase, hopefully, in the video encoding test. But at the same time, if you keep an eye on those temperatures, I'm guessing they're going to skyrocket, because that's what we know is currently the issue with the AVX side of the chip. It uses a lot more power. But as long as this is stable and runs, then I will also do some, further tests myself to see what temperature I can get away with until we improve the cooling. But hopefully I want to push a much better result on the video encoding side. So you can see there a massive gain in the encoding. It's now up to 346 when it was at, I believe originally maybe 180, and then with the gain or 220, somewhere around those numbers. But I know there wasn't much of a gain between the two. Now there's a significant gain. I think we could push that more again. Obviously, we could increase the frequency more or give it more power. But you'll notice the temperature did spike and thermal throttle. So it did reach 100 degrees, and then the frequency thermal throttled, which was what was giving us, that potential issue. We don't want to be constantly thermal throttling. So that's really the only part I was interested in there, was the encoding. But I'll just let this test finish. So there's the results on that. One last thing I will do, actually, thinking about that, is I'll now re-enable the extreme memory profile for the RAM and run this once more. So I'll just jump back into the BIOS once more and re-enable that XMP, and then run this test again. So these are the settings that we're finally tweaking. I've enabled XMP, and then it's automatically changed these settings in the RAM. So effectively this is overclocking the RAM. So let's give that a run. So you can see there we've now increased the encoding even further. So we've now got 225 as a system score. If I just uncheck them and run that once more, the quick one, we can see we can beat 375 now it's warmed up. Halted due to mouse movement. Try again. But that's obviously a hint there that the RAM is also playing a part in the video encoding bottleneck now, in order to increase that speed. You can also look at the package temperatures with thermal throttling due to the AVX. So this score now could improve by fixing the AVX heat issue and potentially boosting the RAM even further. But again, you can just keep going, but you can see how, where we've now got the system to compared to where it started. So that's it. Hopefully you've enjoyed overclocking a CPU as well as the RAM, and seeing that ultimately the overclocking can be as simple as altering a ratio to boost the clock speed up, and then running some tests and seeing if your system can stabilize. And then we went further into the overclocking and started delving into those custom settings. So we overclocked the RAM, which was as easy as just enabling the new profile, the XMP profile, which I wouldn't really recommend manually overclocking RAM. That is very difficult to do. And then on the CPU, it's still the basic setting of once you've changed the ratio, if it gets unstable, maybe start looking at manually setting the voltage. Increase the voltage by 0.05 volts at a time. The general rule of thumb is you increase the frequency first until it's unstable, and then boost the voltage up slowly because that draws more power. You want to use the least amount of power while being stable. So you kind of boost frequency and then boost the voltage up slowly, boost frequency. And then while you're doing that, you're looking for then thermal throttling, that your CPU ends up getting too hot. Anything above 100 degrees plus starts to thermal throttle. And overall, you don't want your system running constantly anywhere above, say, 80 to 90 degrees. And you don't want it peaking anywhere above that, really. That's kind of your maximum temperature I'd be comfortable running with to not shorten the lifespan of the CPU. But hopefully you've seen me mess with quite a lot of different things. The AVX, the floating point unit stuff, stressing the CPU separate to the cache, separate to the FPU, and kind of finding out what is your bottleneck in the system and what is the thing that crashes it. So hopefully it's been useful. It's taken away any of the fear of overclocking, the dangers and the fears. There's not really that much to fear. And interestingly, changing the thermal paste in this case to a really high-end grade thermal paste made absolutely no difference that I noticed, which could be a sign that potentially this specific CPU I'm using has the lid on that is more the thermal limit than the paste itself, which means the lid's dissipating the heat at the most optimum speed it can, but the lid touching the die is where the issue is, which is where we'll probably go next and delid the CPU. So hopefully this video was useful. Any questions or comments, leave them and I'll get back to you.